Hi, everyone. So, have you ever wondered what menopause might have been like back in, let's say, ancient Greece? Well, I have. And maybe that's because, in addition to being a nurse researcher, I also have a background in medical anthropology. So, these kinds of historical things related to health and the culture of health are very interesting to me. So, a couple of years ago, I did a continuing ed program for nurses that looked at the history of menopause. And I came up with a lot of really interesting bits of information that I thought might be fun to share with you. And yes, I know the thinking is that women never lived long enough to have menopause back then, but actually, you may find some of this information quite interesting. So, take a look. So let's start with as far back as I was able to go with the information, and that is the 4th and 5th century BC. That's right. um, there were actually no physicians, of course, back then. There were lots of gods and goddesses, but mostly poets and philosophers. And these two were prominent philosophers in the day, and that would be Hippocrates on the left and Aristotle on the right. And of course, their job in their communities was to try and figure out the hows and the whys of things. And so, of course, there were lots of things that were not known back then. And so, especially in terms of nature, how did things work? All right. Um, and when it came to women, women were incredibly mysterious. Menstruation, menstruation was like, why do women bleed? Why do they stop bleeding? What's the purpose of it? Because of course these were two old white guys and they did not bleed. So they gave this a lot of thought. And one of the things that Aristotle took note of was that women stopped bleeding after the age of 50. And that is something he noted in his writing. So, okay, we have at least one little bit of information that some women, at least back then, did experience or live to the point of menopause. So, the Hippocratic Corpus is a collection of about 60 works that have been associated with Hippocrates. Let's take a peek at a little bit of what he had to say. He said, blood gathers in the womb, increasing and traveling to parts of the body, such as the heart, where it may cause serious trouble. Symptoms of shivering and fever ensue, followed by madness and suicidal urges. The cure, according to Hippocrates, was to get pregnant, conception. And when women were unable to get pregnant and were infertile, they were much more prone to these problems that he was noticing and starting to describe. So, what's interesting about this also, this collection of works that are supposedly from Hippocrates, we can never really be sure because that was a long time ago. But what's interesting is that many actually consider it to be the first textbook of gynecology. So, gives you some insight into how they were beginning to think and try and figure out this whole thing about menstruation. And so they go on to say that women cease to menstruate because they no longer have an excess of nourishment that was used when they were accumulating menstrual blood. In other words, the menstrual blood was this excess amount of nourishment that women had. So they believed, or they came to the conclusion, that in order to balance that out, they had to menstruate in order to have a more balanced nutritional or nourishment, state of nourishment. And so when a woman was pregnant, the reason they thought they no longer bled was because now that blood that used to come out with menstruation was now nourishing the developing fetus. So these philosophers also had some thoughts about men. It wasn't just women that they were trying to figure out. They said, wherefore also in men, the organ of generation, which I have to assume they were talking about the penis, becoming rebellious and masterful, like an animal disobedient to reason and maddened with the sting of lust, seeks to gain absolute sway. And so there was a little bit of madness that they also noticed in men as well as in women. And you'll see reference to this sort of animal within for both men and women in some of the future work as well. So there was another popular philosophy back then, a philosopher rather back then, and his name was Plato. He actually is one of my favorites. I really like his writings. So he had some thoughts about women, just like the rest of them, and he wrote these really long monologues about women and other things in nature. That was called Timaeus. It was written, now get this, these were written about 360 BC. So this was his sort of take on the physical world and all the living things that were in it. Plato's writings were very similar to Hippocrates and Aristotle, but he added a little different twist to it. This is what he had to say. And the same is the case with the so-called womb or matrix of women. Here you go, the animal within them is desirous of procreating children, and when remaining unfruitful long beyond its proper time, gets discontented and angry, and wandering in every direction through the body, closes up the passages of the breath, and by obstructing respiration, drives them to extremity, again causing all varieties of disease. So this was his new twist, that the uterus was this wandering type uterus. When it's not able to grow and develop another human being, it gets disgruntled, and being unfruitful, it gets angry. And then all kinds of diseases can result because it goes wandering around the body. So what Plato is also saying here is that the norm, the healthy place for women was to be pregnant, or else they wouldn't be healthy. So here's a picture of that wandering uterus, the wandering womb, as it was portrayed back then. It was later considered the source of the word hysteria, a Greek word which means uterus. And so you can imagine this wandering uterus getting hysterical. So again, basically, the thinking of the time was that the uterus wandered around a woman's body, caused trouble wherever it went, and it was very much the cause of women's fluctuating hormones when she wasn't menstruating. So interesting, again, they were taking note of the changes that women were experiencing even within their cycles. And I think in addition to that, I think it's really important to note here that it wasn't just about biology. This was also the rationale that helped to keep women in their place. Women in ancient Greece were not allowed to hold political office or become priests or knights. They were considered just too unstable. And the more they could create that scenario of being unstable, the better it was for the men in those communities. That they felt that women's role and women's job was to procreate because that made them healthier and raise children. Now, personally, I think it's a lot more difficult to be in public office or to raise children than to be in public office. But that's just my view. So this notion of instability, that women were not stable because of their menses, or because they have this uterus that is something that we see having been carried for centuries. Remember, this is back in around 300, 400 BC. All right. And I think it's important to remember where the seeds of this thinking comes from, because there's a really long history of trying to use women's biology to keep women in their place. So, moving along from ancient Greece into biblical times, there's also quite a few interesting bits of history to take note of here. Namely, Sarah in the Old Testament, Abraham's wife, she was noted to be 127 years old. Now, do I think she was actually 127? I don't know. Maybe. The oldest human being we have on record, female, was in her 120s. I mean, so I don't know. It's possible. But really, that's not the important point here. The important point is not exactly how old she was, but the fact that she was old. And I think, having that reference that she is old tells us that there were some old women. And let's look into that a little bit deeper, because they also speak about Abraham. And actually, in Paul's letter to the Romans, Abraham, he said, was being not weak in faith, but considered his own body now dead, is how that was described. And what that says to me, possibly, was that Abraham was maybe having a few problems with impotence, that sense of deadness. And it was noted that he had these problems when he was about 100 years old, which would be understandable if that were his true chronological age. But it could also be something that occurred in his 50s and 60s, while Sarah was also having some issues. And then it goes on to say in that letter to the Romans that Sarah being neither yet the deadness of Sarah's womb. So Sarah's womb was considered dead as well. So my thinking on this is that she probably wasn't menstruating for quite a while. Or at least that's my take on it. I've thought about it a lot, and I think that she might have been perimenopausal. Maybe she went for 8-9 months without having a period, and they thought her uterus was dead. And maybe, they thought that since Abraham could not give her a baby, that he too maybe he wasn't impotent. Maybe they just considered him as also having a dead organ of generation. But then maybe what happened is she maybe had an ovulation, and suddenly she got pregnant. I mean, we know that today, that can happen more often than not. So the fact that they gave such large numbers for their age certainly does indicate that Sarah and Abraham were old. And it doesn't really matter the exact number, but the scenario that's being described does kind of make you wonder if she was perimenopausal and they were not getting her pregnant. Now, the ancient world certainly had lots of older men, and we have lots of evidence for that, much more than we have for women. And that's probably because they were more valued, not because there were necessarily more of them. In my mind, it's sort of a wonder that men have historically lived to middle age at all, because, well, yes, women had a high risk of mortality from childbirth, for sure, but men went off to war, all right, and they were in constant battles, all right. So I think we can't negate the impact that would have on them as well, and I think it evens out. So we had both older men and older women back then. So let's get into this whole lifespan issue of women not having lived long enough to experience menopause until recently, because I hear it all the time. And I think we need to look critically at some of the artifacts and the evidence that we have from those ancient years. The other thing to keep in mind is that there were a lot fewer people on the planet back then. So there weren't large numbers of women who they could document as being old, but we do have evidence that older women did exist back then. So you could see some of that in ancient art. The sculpture of the woman on the screen here is an old woman in the marketplace. And she's wearing this thin, rather elegant dress, and she has some sandals on. But the most important thing to note here is that the garment she's wearing is slipped off her shoulder. And this is a detail that's often seen when old women were represented in art or in sculpture back then, because it hints at the liberation that was afforded to those older women from the restrictions that had been placed on them during their childbearing years. So she was allowed to be herself and let her dress reflect that. And again, that's a piece of evidence, all right, that older women did exist, all right, on our planet. So that concludes my little bit of information to share with you that has to do with ancient times and menopause, at least what I know of it at this point. We do know that it was a known phenomenon back as far as ancient Greece and biblical times. We did take note that menstruation and the lack of it was associated with various diseases, not the least of which is madness, another sort of mode of thinking that has been carried through over the centuries. And that pregnancy was the desired condition of women back then, again, carried through many, many centuries following. And that changes associated with reproductive aging were in fact noted in both men and women, but they seem to think that men lived longer, and I would dispute that. It was a long time ago. We don't have a lot of evidence, but we do have little gems that are really interesting. And I think we have to believe that menopause has been around a very long time, as long as human beings have been on the earth. Now, if you thought this was kind of fun and you enjoyed listening to me share this information with you, let me know, because I could go further and take you into the Middle Ages and some of the 16th and 17th century, 18th century, and on up. So let me know, and I'd be happy to share with you.